An abandoned concrete pyramid dominating the American Midwest.
It looks like the set of some temple of doom.
A group of ominous structures rusting away at sea.
This looks like aliens are standing out in the water. It's quite a sight to see.
And one of the biggest machines ever built, forgotten in a field.
It's just unbelievable.
Once, they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet. At the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? At the northern edge of North Dakota, just 15 miles from the Canadian border, stands one of America's most incredible and mysterious structures. Standing on top of a sloping mound, a 79 feet tall, slab-sided, concrete pyramid looms over the surrounding plains.
This thing looks downright sinister. This has to be one of the weirdest looking things in the entire country.
There's a brooding menace about the whole environment.
There are no windows visible. Sloped at 56 degrees, the otherwise blank surfaces of each wall are punctuated with strange, large white discs.
You're confronted with something completely unworldly for where you are. This giant structure has the impression of an Aztec pyramid.
The giant pyramid is in the center of a 470-acre field, surrounded by dozens of underground silos, security fences, and derelict guard posts. But this is no ordinary industrial complex.
When you get closer, you can see this was some kind of military installation. But what? These monolithic structures springing out of the ground? You have a concrete parking lot that has hatches and pillars. What is this? Who built it and why?
And why was this giant pyramid abandoned? In the Cold War of the early 1960s, the nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States is reaching a crisis point. A fierce debate breaks out within America's armed forces about the best way to protect the nation and its arsenal of missiles from annihilation by Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles.
By the 1960s, the popular imagination has fixed on the idea that nuclear war will involve all-out total war assault.
Nuclear Armageddon was very much on the horizon. The potential for mass destruction was very real.
The Soviet Union truly respected one thing only, and that was military force. And so we had to show that our technology was equal or better than theirs.
So the U.S. Army raises the stakes of military defense and develops this, the Nakoma Anti-Ballistic Missile System. At the heart of the complex is a state-of-the-art radar.
This is a one-of-a-kind radar system that was constructed at the height of the Cold War, the height of American paranoia.
Construction of this installation begins in the late 1960s. Teams of engineers excavate nearly 1 million cubic feet of earth to create a vast pit, 53 feet into the ground. They line it with concrete, reinforced by 22,000 tons of iron and steel, to shield against nuclear electromagnetic radiation. Inside, multiple floors cover 127,000 square feet and contain all the tactical operational systems and weapon control. The groundbreaking radar has ambition.
The technology develops to create a virtual radar antenna that is capable of focusing in different directions without actually having to move a big piece of steel mesh.
The phased array is a radar that will, through the computer system, will detect a missile or an object coming in from Russia at a greater distance.
This was the cutting edge of technology to allow the USA to feel safe that should there be a strike from the USSR, they'd be able to take out those nuclear warheads before they landed on American soil.
But achieving this level of defense requires the most advanced computer in the Western world at the time. Engineered to handle 10 million instructions per second, the radar's computer is located deep beneath the blast-proof pyramid. It controls an on-site fleet of 46 missiles held in underground launch silos, designed to shoot down incoming Soviet weapons, all directed by the huge circular radar dishes mounted on each side of the pyramid. But the system faces incredible defense challenges.
The Nakoma system was operating at the limits of 1960 technology. And the biggest problem they had was you had seconds to decide, are you going to fire your missile to stop that missile? Or is it a decoy? Is it something else?
To be effective, it had to be able to target multiple Soviet nuclear missiles, all at the same time.
The radars could detect a Soviet missile incoming and give 6 minutes warning. The missiles could hit a target on 30 seconds notice. That meant that as long as the big computers could make their decisions fast enough, a nuclear-tipped missile could be in the air and intercepting an inbound Soviet ICBM in time to blow it up.
Working out these technologies takes many years. And it isn't until late 1975 that the Nakoma base is finally fully equipped with both long-range Spartan and short-range Sprint nuclear missiles. These weapons ensure that there are 2 chances of taking out incoming Soviet missiles.
We have here Sprint missile field. You'll notice that there's a white cover on top of this missile site. That is mainly fiberglass. When they fire this missile, it will go directly through the fiberglass. When they launch these Spartan missiles, you'll notice that there is a steel rail on each side. When this missile is ready for firing, they send the signal, and then there's explosive charges in that area, and they'll blow this cover out of the way and be speeded on its way to the outer atmosphere.
So will this high-tech missile defense system actually work? And why was it abandoned? In North Dakota lies a forgotten remnant of the Cold War, the Nakoma anti-ballistic missile system. Completed in 1975, the complex costs $5 billion, the modern-day equivalent of $27 billion.
Those missiles were so fast and so accurate and directed by radars that were so powerful that the United States was able to demonstrate its capability to the point at which the US could be made invulnerable to Soviet attack, scared the hell out of the Russians.
But in early 1976, the American political climate takes a new turn. After just 5 months of full combat readiness, the U.S. government believes projects like Nakoma are ineffective war deterrents and abruptly shuts the complex down, leaving it abandoned.
Although it was technically operational, rumor has it, it was only ever switched on, screens alight, lights flashing, buzzing noises, for 3 days.
So when you look at Nakoma, you're in for a shock. When we waste money, we really go down in flames, don't we? I mean, this has to be one of the greatest waste of taxpayers' money in the Cold War, if not in history.
But many experts think that the billions spent at Nakoma actually helped to keep the Soviets in check.
If you look at it that way, the very fact that the nuclear war never did break out, maybe the American taxpayers did get value for money.
If $5 billion was the cost of nuclear peace, that is $5 billion well spent.
Today, the Nakoma Safeguard Complex lies abandoned in a remote corner of North Dakota.
Plans are afoot for Nakoma to be opened up as a tourist attraction. Now, you might think, well, why am I going to want to travel a distance and pay money to go and visit this giant concrete eyesore? Well, you could look at it this way. It's a monument to the fact that the two nations could come together and resolve their issues to create peace.
Despite its short active life, Nakoma pushed the boundaries of radar and computer technology. It proved that simply flooding the planet with nuclear missiles was not the way to win the Cold War.
And I think reason enough to keep Nakoma as it is, and to go along to learn about that history and feel the significance of what is otherwise just this giant, mysterious concrete structure.
Over 4,000 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, off the east coast of England, a group of bizarre, rusting iron structures stick out of the ocean, looking like something from War of the Worlds.
Looks like an alien standing as a sentry. Coming out of the water almost looks like deposited from an alien civilization. It's completely out of character from what you would expect.
Standing 80 feet above the sea are 7 huge steel boxes, weighing 750 tons, supported on 4 17-feet-long splayed concrete legs, extending down into the waters.
Being out there and living in one of these structures must have been very intense and rather quite terrifying. You sort of know there are people nearby, but it must have been a very, very isolating and scary experience.
It's easy to see from their corroded steel plating that these mysterious structures have been derelict for years. But what drove engineers to create such bizarre constructions in such an inhospitable place? What was their purpose, and why were they abandoned? In the early 1940s, the Second World War has reached a turning point. Hitler is enraged by Allied bomber raids on Germany and plans to obliterate London in a devastating aerial offensive. So the British military develops a top-secret defense project, and for good reason. The designs are like nothing that has ever been seen before. The River Thames is crucial to London's survival. This lifeline allows supplies of all kinds to flow into the city and transports the goods made in its factories to the warfronts.
Churchill and the British had to make sure that nobody ever came up the River Thames to threaten London.
Often really sound, practical engineering solutions can be born out of what's a very difficult and tragic situation.
And Britain's do-or-die solution to the Nazi threat is the Red Sands Sea Fort. It's part of a string of defenses equipped with heavy anti-aircraft guns across the mouth of the Thames.
This was total war. And in total war, you do not leave the river that goes up to your metropolis undefended.
But will the Red Sands Sea Fort actually stop the Nazis' legendary Air Force? And why was it abandoned? Off the coast of England lie 7 abandoned installations from the Second World War. The Red Sands Sea Fort. Construction begins in 1942. In the past, creating defenses at sea had been a long and complex process, but engineers try a new building technique. And on land, with prefabrication.
Taking a fort and constructing it in an easy location and then floating it out into a strategically beneficial location was a groundbreaking and very important innovation in terms of offshore construction and engineering projects.
Each fort consists of a concrete grid base with angled legs at each corner. These support a 36 by 36 foot, 2-story accommodation block and gun platform on top.
So there's 2 really basic principles of structural engineering that have been used in the design of these towers. First one is making sure that the weight of the structure is as low as possible, because the lower that is, the more stable your structure is. Second great principle that we're seeing is the use of a triangle. So by having a wide base and bringing the legs up almost into a point, you've kind of recreated that stability of a triangle. And structural engineers absolutely adore triangles because they're a really stable shape.
And there's a real need for stability. The total weight of each tower is a staggering 580 tons, but still light enough to be carried out by tugboat to their position. 3 groups of 7 towers are built to defend the Thames. The majority are armed with heavy anti-aircraft guns.
This is the whole heart of the operation. We are now on the platform with a 3.7-inch gun, of which there are 3 others on each of the other gun towers. The gun that was out here was very effective. They were controlled by radar and a Sperry predictor, which was a piece of kit that sat between the radar and the gun, which could automatically get the gun to lock onto their target.
By the end of 1943, the Thames forts are ready for battle. There's only one thing missing: the 165 soldiers needed to man each group of 7 towers.
To operate the gun, there were 2 crew on the gun itself, and then there were lots of people in the control tower and also watching by the searchlight.
But living conditions are brutal.
Coming down here is the shell lockers all around the site, all around the gun towers, which held the 3.7-inch shells. They were brought up from the armory and loaded into these lockers.
Since this was a military structure, the human consideration of the occupants was probably not a priority. It was more about, can it withstand the weather? Can it withstand an enemy attack? And then let's worry about the comfort of the operators.
If it meant using thousands and thousands of rounds of ammunition to try to shoot down only a few German aircraft, that's what you do. And if it meant that soldiers and sailors had to live under miserable conditions in the North Sea in all kinds of weather, with only a little bit of fresh water and only occasional resupply, that's what you do.
But will the Red Sands Sea Fort survive the Nazis' aerial raids? And why was it abandoned? Rising out of the ocean off the coast of England, 7 rusting seaforts guard the entrance to the River Thames that leads to the heart of London. During World War II, they proved to be an outstanding success against Nazi aircraft. In the end, these heavily armored anti-aircraft platforms shoot down dozens of planes, as well as the Nazis' deadly V-1 bombs, sending them plummeting into the sea.
Having anti-aircraft artillery pointed at anyone who tries to approach London up the River Thames limits German options. The German bombers that attacked London during the Blitz, they could not just drive right up the river and attack London.
These stark forts are one of the most extraordinary engineering successes that helped lead the Allies to victory in 1945. After having fulfilled their purpose, the British government decommissions them in 1956, leaving them abandoned. Today, 7 of the original Red Sand Seafort towers remain, rusting away at sea.
The fact that the Red Sands forts are still standing to this day is a testament to the quality of the engineering and construction involved in making them and putting them to use.
Engineering can't last forever, and these have served their purpose, so it's often a difficult decision, but sometimes we do just have to accept that things just can't be there forever.
"3,600 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean is an empty, abandoned, and unusually shaped complex that sits in the heart of the densely populated city of Philadelphia.
When you come across what looks like a medieval castle in Philadelphia with battlements and flags waving from turrets, it looks like someone airlifted one of the spectacular medieval buildings in France, the ones that inspired Disneyland, and just dropped it in the middle of Philadelphia.
Taking up over 9.8 acres of a whole city block, there is over half a mile of 30 feet high, 10 feet thick stone walls, which contrasts against the homes and offices that fill the surrounding streets. With 7 corridors extending outward from an octagonal central towering hub, this massive abandoned complex is shaped like a wagon wheel.
It's decaying and moldy and dark and damp, a haunted place where you definitely don't want to spend any time.
It's really spooky. You could smell the paint peeling off of the walls and the damp concrete. It's really, really eerie.
But what was the purpose of this strange site? And why was it abandoned? In the early 1800s, the state of Pennsylvania has a problem. The prisons they control are overcrowded, hard to keep orderly, and inhumane for the inmates.
For decades, prisons were cold, crowded buildings where inmates were just crammed in like chickens in a coop, inviting disease, violence, even death.
So officials plan a bold new site for the rehabilitation of prisoners, the Eastern State Penitentiary. The aim is to create a state-of-the-art prison that revolutionizes the criminal justice system and puts all others around the world to shame.
You could see that this was a real reaction to a social reform. And at the time, very revolutionary indeed.
In 1822, work begins on America's biggest and most expensive prison project, costing the modern equivalent of $20 billion.
Architect of this prison, John Haviland, had to think of all the daily needs of a person while they were by themselves. So consequently, this prison was built with central heat, central plumbing, ventilation. It was the first environmentally controlled place for human life.
It's a drastic change from the chaos and violence of ordinary communal prisons, which experts believe give inmates no chance to reform. And in 1829, this humanitarian prison opens. The purpose behind the design is to give the occupants individual rooms.
Each inmate has their own cell. They also have their own little skylight. And this is interesting because the whole thinking was about social reform.
The idea was, we're not just going to punish prisoners, we're going to allow them time to reflect and repent. The word penitentiary comes from repent. So they isolated each prisoner by himself in a cell. They didn't get to talk to each other. They were supposed to spend their days in quiet contemplation of their crimes.
Prisoners were let out of their cells twice a day for exercise in an individual open-air yard. And the idea here was the fresh air and sunlight would keep people healthy.
The initial design features 450 individual cells, but to supervise so many in an ordinary prison would take an army of guards. British architect John Haviland solved this problem by introducing a unique layout with a central hub.
With a really ingenious design of having what is effectively a wagon wheel, a central hub where the guards can look out in every direction and see the cells going off in the distance.
The design of the penitentiary was actually extremely innovative. It meant that a small group of guards could keep an eye on the whole prison from that one location.
But creating a model prison to revolutionize the treatment of offenders is not cheap. With a price tag of the modern equivalent of $20 billion, it is one of the most expensive public building projects ever carried out in the United States of America.
This is 1828. Now, each inmate has their own central heating, their own wash basin, their own flush toilet. Now, let's put that in perspective. The White House, the president, he doesn't have his own flush toilet. These guys do.
Prisoners were in solitary confinement, but they did have enough food. They weren't threatened by violence from other prisoners. You can see why the founders of the prison thought it was a step forward.
So will this revolutionary prison design actually rehabilitate the inmates? And why was it abandoned? In the heart of Philadelphia lies a forsaken complex specifically designed to rehabilitate prisoners, the Eastern State Penitentiary. But after only a few years of operation, problems begin to surface in the 1830s. To accommodate a growing number of prisoners, engineers must expand the penitentiary and alter the original design.
They had to double the cells. They had to bring in a whole lot more prisoners. So all those nice design features about solitude that would foster reflection, that was gone. The prison kept working. It kept functioning, but it was no longer the idyllic prison of the future it once was.
Even the advanced features of the cells failed to work as planned.
There were furnaces at the end of the cell blocks, and they were to heat the tunnels underneath the cells, and then the air was to flow in. But the people closest to the furnaces were getting carbon monoxide sickness, and the people on the other ends were getting frostbite.
The flush toilets were flushed twice a week by the prison guards. Twice a week. And hence the stench that this created, it was legendary.
On a practical level, the whole idea of rigid separation of prisoners proves impossible to maintain. Cells designed for one man soon have to house 2 or 3. By the end of the century, after numerous decades of operation, the notion of solitary confinement, originally intended to make prisoners reflect and reform, has been replaced with overcrowding and harsh, unsanitary conditions. But in 1929, the prison still manages to employ solitary confinement to try to rehabilitate one of the most notorious criminals of all time.
Yeah, the Eastern State Penitentiary actually had quite a few famous prisoners in it, the most famous being Al Capone, who spent a few years there for a minor charge.
Now, he was serving 8 months, although his original sentence was longer. He described his time there as easy. Well, it would be easy when you have your own sofa, your own bookcase, and your own record player that you play waltzes on. It couldn't have been that easy, though, because we know he spent a good deal of his bootlegging income trying to get that sentence even further reduced.
For 4 more decades, the prison continues to operate despite its notorious conditions. But in 1970, because of overcrowding, the once revolutionary prison finally closes its doors for good. Today, the dilapidated Eastern State Penitentiary lies deserted in the middle of bustling Philadelphia.
After it was closed, the whole site became abandoned. But then a consortium of concerned citizens got involved and said, no, this is a historic landmark. We need to make it into a museum. And that's what it is today. And that feels about right.
Despite its many drawbacks, its groundbreaking design was copied all over the world. More than 300 central hub prisons are built. But the whole concept of solitary confinement comes to be seen not as a way of reforming criminals, but as punishment in itself.
At the time, it was thought to be this very enlightened, gentle way to treat these prisoners, give them time to reflect. But in fact, it was solitary confinement, a very cruel punishment to isolate people. And spending months and years in these cells all by yourself, it's really hard to imagine.
Over 4,000 miles away, across the Atlantic in Schipkau, East Germany, south of the capital city of Berlin, an abandoned, corroding mass of steel towers over the landscape. Surrounding this monster machine are empty fields and silent pine forests, which veil the purpose of this extraordinary structure, or why it's here.
You're just completely flabbergasted at the enormity of this thing in front of you.
This thing looks like something out of Star Wars. It's giant superstructure. It's 160 feet high. It's got this evil-looking wheel at the front of it.
The vast bulk of this rusting hulk stretches for more than 500 feet and is made up of 3 grid-like arms, all connected by a spider's web of steel cables, stretching over the towering superstructure.
It's very science fiction. You'd be forgiven for thinking this is definitely some kind of contraption built by an evil genius planning to take over the world. It's just unbelievable.
Incredibly, this metal leviathan was once mobile. 2 tank-like continuous tracks support around 4,000 tons of weight. And control cabins perched among the girders show that it even carried a crew. But what was this mysterious machine? Who built it? And why was it abandoned in the middle of nowhere? In the 1960s, the communist country of East Germany is changing its economic policies to boost its industrial growth. But to fuel its power stations and meet energy demands, this communist dictatorship must tap into its key energy deposits, brown coal. Without increasing its mining efforts, the country will come to a standstill. But getting at the huge deposits lying just below the surface is costly and incredibly labor-intensive. So in 1964, the heavy engineering East German firm VEB Lochhammerwerk develops something radical.
When designing structures at such a scale, engineers face many challenges, mostly due to the sheer size. Things weigh so much that modern materials are almost at their limit.
When you take a closer look at some of the elements on the extremities of this giant monster, you can slowly figure out what the purpose of it was.
This is Schaufelradbagger, or Bucket Wheel Excavator 258. It is one of the largest machines ever built. Nicknamed Bagger 258, this is a strip mining excavator designed to efficiently remove the layer of earth and rock above veins of brown coal running close to the surface.
There is nothing delicate about strip mining with Bagger 258. This thing removes yards of earth at a time in this great big long trench, following the coal underneath the Earth's surface until you get down to what you're after, the coal.
Though the company manufactures 13 types of these machines, they only make one Bagger 258, and they unleash it in 1965. The key element of the Bagger is its immense cutting wheel. 40 feet in diameter, each of its 10 buckets can hold over 50,000 cubic feet of earth and rock, allowing it to cut deep into the surface at astonishing speed.
This thing is shoveling up thousands of tons of earth and rock at a time before dropping it onto its own conveyor belt to shift it away, all the while trundling along on its tracks to continuously eat up the earth in front of it. The machine doesn't do it justice. This thing's a factory on tracks.
Bucket wheel excavators are amazingly complex in terms of their abilities to move, function, and otherwise just do their job with a minimal amount of human involvement.
When you see the size and the complexity of Bagger, you'd imagine it would need an army of people to actually operate it. But that's not the case. It only takes 5 people to run, and all of them are situated on board in its own little control room. So whilst it might have cost the Earth to build, running it comes relatively cheap.
There's a trade-off between building one machine that's really big and using dozens or hundreds of trucks and shovels. Obviously, if something breaks, you're in trouble and you need to shut down. But overall, the bucket wheel excavator is so much more efficient that it's worth the risk.
But will Bagger 258 be able to deliver enough coal to fuel the needs of communist East Germany? And why is it abandoned? Rusting away in a remote field in rural East Germany is the massive bucket wheel excavator Bagger 258. Under communist rule, it begins work in 1965, and though it's designed to extract coal with efficiency, it's slow. At around 4,000 tons, it's only able to move at 6 yards a minute, and moving is no simple matter.
That's hardly going to beat any world land speed records, but it's actually extremely impressive when you consider the size and the weight of this thing. In fact, it weighs so much. As it moves, any ground ahead of it needs to be specially prepared. And any roads it crosses needs to be prepared so that it doesn't just pulverize the surface. Yes, Bagger is mobile, but mobility comes at a cost.
One of the big challenges is you've got to move the bucket constantly, so it's always digging in to fresh soil or fresh coal. The bucket excavator has to pivot as the wheel is turning into fresh soil. Then the whole thing also has to creep forward in order to move into new areas to be excavated.
However, that's not the only operational hazard this engineering giant must face.
What strikes me about Bagger is the number of appendages that it has sticking out from its main body. You've got a spoil arm sticking out the back that then spits out all of that earth into trucks waiting to take it away. But crucially, you also need a counterbalance arm. Now this counterweights the forces and the stresses at the front of the machine as it digs through the earth. Otherwise, the whole thing would just topple over.
For decades, Bagger 258 successfully mines coal across eastern Germany. And even after German unification in 1990, it's still used to fuel the country's energy needs until 2002. Then, it simply runs out of things to dig, so operation is halted and the machine is abandoned. Today, Bagger 258 is rusting away in a remote and empty field. And in more ways than one, it's left an indelible mark on the landscape.
The problem with large bucket wheel excavators is that they're made of man-made materials, metals, that do not weather very well. So preserving them for future generations would be very expensive, very costly, such that leaving them in the field is probably the only true solution we have for us.
Bagger 258 has been left to rot. It has been abandoned. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Rightly or wrongly, we're still massively dependent on fossil fuels today. And Bagger 258, for me, is a reminder and a monument to the effort and the ingenuity required to exploit the Earth's resources in the way we do.